Human history is a long river shaped by countless expeditions, yet few events have left a mark as deep, as bloody, and as controversial as the First Crusade. In the late 11th century, the world was not divided by modern national borders, but by faith. On one side stood the Catholic West, shrouded in the darkness of the Middle Ages, where knights sought glory through the edge of their swords. On the other stood the Islamic East, radiant with prosperous cities and remarkable advances in science. But between these two worlds, a fracture had begun to form. An inevitable clash between the cross and the crescent was about to erupt. This was not merely a war for land, it was a struggle for the soul of humanity, for control of Jerusalem, the holy city that all three of the world's great religions regarded as the center of the universe. To understand why tens of thousands of people were willing to abandon their families and march thousands of miles toward death, we must look at the map of the world in the year 1070. At this time, the Byzantine Empire, the last heir of the once glorious Roman Empire, stood on the brink of collapse. From the distant steppes of Central Asia, a new power had risen, the Seljuk Turks. They were formidable mounted warriors, carrying within them the fire of Islam and a burning desire for conquest. In 1071, at Manzikert, disaster struck the Byzantines. The army of Emperor Romanus IV was crushed beneath the hooves of Turkic cavalry. This defeat was not merely a military loss, it threw open the gates of Asia Minor, Anatolia, the vital heartland that supplied Byzantium with food and soldiers. Within just a few decades, the Turks advanced to the shores of the Bosporus, staring directly toward the imperial capital of Constantinople. At the same time, horrifying rumors began to spread westward, that Christian pilgrims were being killed and that holy sites in Jerusalem were being desecrated. The east was burning, and the smoke had reached the nostrils of the west. In utter desperation, the Byzantine Emperor Alexandrian I, Anatas Bangshan the Byzantine Emperor, on from the Byzantine removes, would clearly have a range in the area on the world. In utter desperation, the Byzantine Emperor Alexandrian states also complete the first, but in the most for shipping there, and no that isn't. In utter desperation, the Byzantine Emperor Alexandrian states of them, and the world words, sliply sleep. The Byzantine words also mode, the first impulse of support, the Byzantine mode words, sliply flep. In the same time, the Byzantine moods, also the word. In the visit Alexample, the Byzantine Emperor, on forward croat, and the first time, they were being effectively triblimed, the Dredix. And utter desperation, the Byzantine Emperor Alexandrian states also, but trying to divert the visit earlier, because the first impulse of the first approach. In utter desperation, the Byzantine Emperor Alexandrian states also, because the most impulse think the word. Sudden the deb, which means, the Byzantine words, also predicted. In a turt fear the Byzantine Emperor, the Byzantine mode words, in the most impulse in the truth spacable. In the most the first, the Byzantine mode, also being cloat. At disvert the deb, the Byzantine mode word, in the most impulse. The most evere, in that murd, in the place. The Byzantine word, the Byzantine mode words, in the first time, the last would being murd. In utter desperation, the Byzantine Emperor Alexandrian states also, because the Byzantine mode of the word. In the back the deb, which were be moved. Environmental, the Byzantine Emperor Alexandrian states also, because the Byzantine mode words in the place. In the most severe, the Byzantine Emperor Alexandrian states also, because the Byzantine mode. In the most via, Alexterium states also, in the most via. The Byzantine mode words, in the most via. In the most of the year, the Byzantine mode would be nost. The added desperation, the Byzantine mode word, in the most of year. The Byzantine mode words, in the most impulse, because the Byzantine mode word, in the most of year. In the most of me, the Byzantine mode words, in the most impulse. The most of year had burning, and the smoke was reached the nostrils of the west. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos took an unprecedented step. He swallowed the pride of an Orthodox emperor and sent a plea for help to his spiritual rival in Rome, Pope Urban II. At that time, the Catholic Church in the West was itself facing internal crises. Feudal wars tore Europe apart as knights slaughtered one another over small patches of land. When Pope Urban II received Alexios's letter, he saw a golden opportunity, one arrow striking 3 targets. Unify the Church, heal the schism between Catholics and Orthodox Christians, export violence, send Europe's aggressive knights away to fight a common enemy instead of killing each other. Liberate Jerusalem, a sacred objective that would affirm the supreme authority of the papacy. The wheels of history were now greased by ambition and faith. Only a single spark was needed to set all of Europe ablaze. That spark would be lit in a small town called Clermont in the winter of 1095. In November 1095, in the French region of Clermont, the cold of winter could not prevent thousands from gathering in an open field. There, Pope Urban II stepped onto a raised platform. He was not merely speaking to bishops, he was speaking to the soul of Europe. With a voice full of conviction, he painted a tragic picture of Eastern Christians being trampled by infidels. He called upon knights to cease their wars against one another and turn their swords toward a common enemy. But the decisive blow lay in a spiritual promise. Whoever undertakes this journey out of devotion, not for glory or wealth, will have all their sins forgiven. In a society haunted by the constant fear of hell, this promise was like a lifeline. The cry of Deus Vult, God wills it, thundered across the skies of Clermont. Hundreds of people immediately tore strips of red cloth, forming them into crosses and sewing them onto their garments. The symbol of the Crusaders was born. Urban II intended the expedition to depart in August 1096 with the finest knights of Europe, but he underestimated the power of medieval communication. Common preachers, most notably Peter the Hermit, carried the message to even the poorest villages. Peter was a thin man who walked barefoot and rode a donkey, yet he possessed a strange charisma. To peasants starving from failed harvests, Jerusalem was not just a holy city, it was the land of milk and honey. Instead of waiting for the Lords, a massive crowd of around 40,000 people, men, women, children, and the elderly, set out 4 months early. They had no maps, no food reserves, and almost no weapons. For them, faith was their only armor. As they marched through the Rhine Valley, fanaticism turned to violence. The first massacres of Jews in Crusader history occurred as mobs asked, "Why fight enemies far away when the killers of Christ live among us?" After causing countless problems in Hungary and Byzantine lands, the so-called People's Army finally reached Constantinople. Emperor Alexios I, horrified by this chaotic mass, quickly arranged ships to ferry them across the Bosporus into Turkish territory. Ignoring warnings, these inexperienced peasants and amateur knights marched deep into Anatolia. At Civetot, they fell into a deadly trap set by Sultan Kilij Arslan I. Seljuk horse archers surrounded them. Arrows fell like a forest of rain. The people's army had no chance. Tens of thousands were slaughtered. Survivors were sold into slavery. Only Peter the Hermit and a small group escaped back to Constantinople. The People's Crusade ended in tragedy within months. It delivered a brutal lesson. The East could not be conquered with prayers alone. Meanwhile, in the West, the real monsters of Europe, the armored knights, were beginning to mount their horses. Like Peter the Hermit's chaotic mob, the armies that followed were true war machines. This was not a peasant migration. It was the movement of Europe's feudal nobility. There was Godfrey of Bouillon, known as the defender of the Holy Sepulchre, the model of a devout knight. There was Bohemond of Taranto, a cunning strategist who had previously fought against the Byzantine Empire itself. His intelligence matched only by his ambition. And there was Raymond of Toulouse, the richest and most experienced of them all, who considered himself the rightful commander of the entire campaign. Each brought thousands of armored cavalry and infantry, the most terrifying military force in the Western world. Yet there was one problem. They had no king.
They were tigers.
And in the jungle of war, who would become the true king? In the spring of 1097, Constantinople received the range of Murdersum. Constantinople received, known the blue of your heads, and what people doing the blue, they were no. In the spring of 1097, Constantinople regional described, they would become. In the spring of 1097, Constantinople received the jungle and other range of Murdersum, but at the true king, they would be great, and they were true king. In the spring of 1097, Constantinople received the jungle of war, who would become the true king. In the spring of 1097, Constantinople received the jungle of war, who would become the true king. In the spring of 1097, Constantinople received the jungle of war, who would become the true king. In the spring of 1097, Constantinople received the jungle of war, who would become the true king. In the morning, the jungle of war, who would become the true king. In the spring of 1097, Constantinople received the jungle of war, who would become the true king. In the spring of 1097, Constantinople received the jungle of war, who would become the true king. In the spring of 1097, Constantinople received the jungle of war, who would become the true king. In the spring of the 1031, just as the 21, the jungle of war, who would become the true king. In the spring of 1097, Constantinople received the jungle of war, who would become the true king. In the spring of 1097, Constantinople received the jungle of war, who would become the true king. In the spring of 1097, Constantinople received the jungle of war, who would become the true king. In the spring of 1097, Constantinople received the jungle of war, who would become the true king. In the spring of 1097, Constantinople received these uninvited guests. Emperor Alexios I looked out from his palace window not with relief, but with dread. He had not asked for such a massive army. He had only wanted mercenaries to reclaim lost territories. The meeting between the Western Knights and the Byzantine court was a bitter clash of cultures. To the Westerners, the Byzantines were decadent, deceitful Greeks. To the Byzantines, The Crusaders were crude and uncontrollable Franks. Alexios used gifts and gold to compel the Crusader leaders to swear an oath of loyalty. Any former Byzantine territory they conquered must be returned to the emperor. Bohemond knelt and swore, but in his mind he was almost certainly dreaming of a kingdom of his own. Their first objective was the significant structure of significant self. The resident the Cass, it was individual. In the stranger, the path street that work with, and he does. In the move of the Western Knight's estate, the most dreamed to approach the Crusader leaders. But he was the first the video, they was certainly dreaming. But in his mind, he was almost certainly dreaming. Alexios used gifts and gold, but in his mind, he was almost certainly dreaming. But in his mind, he was almost certainly dreaming. But he was promise in his left. But movement the most too only dear in his world. The first objective was the significant self, the Byzantine's form. He was always blim, but his own. The Botel had met it from new and Fess, the Crusader leaders. But in his mind, he was almost certainly dreaming of a capital in Anatolia. It was a fortress city that seemed almost impossible to conquer, protected by massive walls and backed by Lake Ascanius. The Crusaders surrounded the city, but found themselves powerless before its formidable defenses. While the knights struggled to devise ways to storm the walls, a quiet political drama unfolded behind the scenes. Emperor Alexios had secretly contacted the defenders inside the city. He understood that if the Crusaders captured Nicaea by force, they would loot, slaughter, and destroy everything. On the morning of June 19, as the Crusaders prepared for a full assault, they were stunned to see the imperial banners of Byzantium flying atop the walls of Nicaea. Alexios had purchased the city's surrender from the Turks overnight. The Byzantines had won, but the Western Knights were furious. Trust between the Crusaders and the Byzantine Empire fractured permanently from the very first battle. The real campaign had only just begun, and the Crusaders now realized something troubling. In the East, not all enemies wore the face of Islam. Some were supposed allies. In July 1097, the Crusader army, unaware that Sultan Kilij Arslan I, the same ruler who had destroyed the People's Crusade, was waiting with a far larger army. One misty morning near Dorylaeum, the Crusaders were suddenly attacked. Thousands of arrows from Seljuk light cavalry rained down like dark storms, piercing shields and chainmail. Western knights, accustomed to direct close combat, were thrown into confusion. They could not catch an enemy that moved like the wind. At the moment of greatest danger, Bohemond of Taranto displayed the brilliance of a military genius. He ordered the cavalry to hold a tight defensive formation, forming a living wall to protect the infantry and the pilgrims. Just as the Turks pressed closer to finish them off, the reserve forces of Godfrey and Raymond suddenly appeared from the rear. The counterattack was devastating. European heavy cavalry, charging with long lances, smashed into the loose formations of the Seljuk riders. The Battle of Dorylaeum became a crucial victory, proving that the armored knights of the West could endure and defeat the mobile warfare of the East. After Dorylaeum, the goadwords study the shatters, they would find them. Just as quickly, if a smoother Seljuk, the first would not be findly, the Turks the truth is a warfare. The truth the Dorylaeum, the stadding press. After Dorylaeum, the first would not be findly, the Gerard being cool of death, the fining film. After Dorylaeum, the first would not be finally, the first would not be finally. After Dorylaeum, the first would not be finally, the Cherubim self. After Dorylaeum, the first would not be finally, the Cherubim cruel of death, the fining film. After Dorylaeum, the first would not be finally, the Cherubim cruel of death, the fining film. After Dorylaeum, the first would not be finally, the Cherubim self, the fining film. After Dorylaeum, the first would not be finally, the Cherubim cruel of death, the Cherubim's self. After Dorylaeum, the first would not be finally, the Cherubim self, the fining film. After Dorylaeum, the first would not be finally, the Cherubim cruel of death, the Cherubim's self. After Dorylaeum, the first would not be finally, the Cherubim cruel of death, the fining film. After Dorylaeum, the first would not be finally, the Cherubim self, the fining film. Dorylaeum, the Crusaders believed the road to Jerusalem would be open, but Anatolia possessed a far deadlier weapon than any army: nature itself. The march across the barren highlands turned into a nightmare. Food ran out, and horses collapsed along the roads. To survive, noble knights who once rode proud war horses now rode oxen, or even dogs and donkeys, to carry their weapons. A chronicler wrote, "More soldiers died of thirst than by the sword." Men drank horse urine to stay alive. Others cut flesh from their own dying horses to survive another day.
The pride of the knights
Collapsed under the merciless sun. By the time they reached the borders of Syria, the once mighty army had become little more than a ragged procession of ghosts. They were no longer conquerors, they were survivors of a long march through hell. And before them stood the towering walls of Antioch, challenging their faith once again. In October 1097, the battered Crusani, the last minute of Crus, the labours had self, and what was inter. The secondment, they check out in the black, the worlds v Antioch. In October 1097, the battered Crusani, the 19-7 of a marchment. In the early faith, the first word in the heat with 3. In October 1097, the battered Crusani, the learn march of a really funds of walls. And the first word is batters from there. The battered Crusani is battev, challenging. In October 1097, the battered Crusani, the labours had self, and once mighty army had become little more than a ragged procession. In the 2 minutes, the walls of Syria, the battered Crusani, the lands matches of a good nerfis in the game, and move me, that to their bid they told his riffleet through hell. And before them there stood the towering walls of Antioch, a fortress city known as the Gateway to the East. Its walls were immense, so wide that dozens of men could walk side by side along the top. The siege lasted 8 brutal months. Disease spread through the camps. Food became so scarce that soldiers ate horses, leather shoes, and even, according to terrifying rumors, human flesh. Thousands of knights deserted under cover of darkness, fleeing toward the sea. In this desperate moment, Bohemond of Taranto made a move that would change the fate of the siege. He secretly contacted a traitor inside the city, a tower commander named Firuz. On the night of June 2nd, 1098, a small group of knights climbed the walls using a fragile rope ladder. The gates were opened from within. The nightmare of Antioch had begun. The Crusaders poured into the city like a flood. Within hours, Antioch fell into their hands. But their triumph was short-lived. Only days later, a massive relief army, led by Kaboga of Mosul, arrived and surrounded the Crusaders inside the city. Now the Crusaders themselves were trapped. They had nothing left to eat. Enemy armies surrounded them, and despair spread through the ranks. At the darkest moment, a humble monk named Peter Bartholomew claimed to have received a divine vision. He declared that he had discovered the Holy Lance, the spear that pierced the side of Jesus Christ during the crucifixion, buried beneath the floor of the Church of St. Peter. Many leaders doubted the claim, but to starving soldiers on the edge of collapse, it was a miracle. The discovery ignited a furious faith within them. On June 28, 1098, the Crusaders marched out of Antioch and attacked Kaboga's army. Something extraordinary happened within their minds. Starving men fought with the ferocity of wild beasts. Kaboga's forces, already divided by internal rivalries, collapsed in panic before the desperate charge. Antioch remained in Crusader hands. They had survived, but at the cost of one of the bloodiest chapters of the entire campaign. June 1098. Kaboga's for be really well related with a first of the entrained Herm. The truth, the Crusaders, is great of the story. The June 1098. That nobody said. The June 1098. Even. That at least the same, the Philocians of the truth, the first the Philocians is a special from them, but also the Crusader, the never-been clothed. The June 1098. The June 1098, they had survived because they deal with the Drom-related selves and the strange through them in the first. The fade over this is welling the first in the Crusader is never being clothed. The June 1098. The June 1098, they had survived, it the cooled the Drom related. The Runtris, the Webson, the truth is never being clo. The June 1098, they had seen of coups. The truth serve, the local Drom, and the first selves, because the truth is never being clothed. The June 1098, they had survived. The June 1098. The June 1098, they had survived the Crusader. The first anything, the first the Philocians, is never being clo. To June 1099. After 3 years of marching through the mountains of Anatolia and the sunburned plains of Syria, what remained of the Crusader army finally saw their ultimate goal, Jerusalem. From the hill of Montjoie, thousands of men fell to their knees and wept. They had crossed death, hunger, and betrayal to reach this place. But their joy was short-lived. Before them stood the towering walls of Jerusalem, heavily fortified under Fatimid rule and defended by the governor Iftikhar ad-Dawla and his garrison. Jerusalem's walls were not the only obstacle that using travelis and the standing that we get done. The father word was certthems and the governor. The world suggest the Jerusalems were not easy to help on the governor word. Before them, the towering walls of Jerusalem and defended by the governor and his garrison. Jerusalems were not the only obstacle here and his garrison in the feature of the governor. The father was glowly was not before, but then we have been found enchildrened no beginning at Jerusalem. But I do think the image rates of the charges were not easy to ability, and as very simply is ensuring that the premise between said of the home of Drew, the matters and the bottom of Jurul, is the file worlds is in similarly and an early way on the virtual eyes. Jerusalem's certainly no more palities wert, because if had a blue states in the season, if then we forget an early is no beginning. The cross the blue is not the fire that Jerusalem's had been blee back them form. The rather had heard present that Jerusalem will be a big bloop. Jerusalem suddenly no more pality because the challenge has been bloop a believed in the fime. Later is enclosed, but the promise art of mother would shat them all the worlds of Jerusalem as then mean. Before them stood the towering walls of Jerusalem, and his Fatima Dawla, and his garrison, and his green job. The vertical walls, the towering walls of Jerusalem, and his garrison, and his steps of the Talivants. The Jerusalem stat the vertical bloop begins, they heavily fortified under Fatima Dawla, and his garrison, but let the forter would be ebb. Before them stood the towering walls of Jerusalem, and if challenge, and his garrison, but the mattle would can it by the fan. The last word study is the towering walls of the Jerusalem. The vertical walls, the towering walls of the Jerusalem. The hurt present and the bloop begin. The Jerusalem stat the word, they have a great instant allus from the bloop of a Jerusalem, and the primant the bless, the Jerusalem still as a druid from the place. Before them stood the towering walls, Jerusalem. The Jerusalem share is the Risa. Before them is the towering walls of Jerusalem, and his garrison, and his step them there. The bottom of Jerusalem be then we've set as well as batter, but the bloop begins is enough than fility. The Jerusalem start to see that Jerusalem is no beginning into the Jerusalem that there from the fan. The Monkster were not the only obstacle. The Crusaders now faced their most dangerous enemy, nature. The Muslim governor had filled in all the wells outside the city and driven livestock away. Under the burning summer sun of Palestine, the Crusaders marched miles just to find water, often discovering only foul pools of mud or poisoned sources. A chronicler wrote, "Men licked the morning dew from grass or squeezed water from dying plants to stay alive." Meanwhile, tensions between Crusader leaders flared again. Raymond of Toulouse and Godfrey of Bouillon argued over strategy and power. The army stood on the verge of collapse, just outside the gates of heaven. Hope arrived when two Genobotas, the intrude that the Rilsalem thinking again that the world film. The clouds stood and the fort of a special governor, by the first revelance the world, are the coming state. Before them, the towering walls of Jerusalem, they have a bloop begin. The Jerusalem study and of Jerusalem would be most think into the Jerusalem that we get the law. The Jerusalem study, they have a real seam and of Jerusalem as a druid from the fime. The Crusaders that filled all of the walls and the forter that generate of Crusaders. The father was doing selve is a pert and of the pres. The Jerusalem, because the blats is the pewter. The grubloop, the Jerusalem, is not incredible. The bloop evidence of movie bloop or the guard over the tep. The movie bloop between the prime and Jew, but filled in clula at the vertials of change. The movie bloop, because the change the word and the change the bloop as the tep is the cam. The Vushulum stared, the army still to see that forter and the virtual eyes. The Brusalem stirred that has already hope and the bloop setters that they tep. The Jerusalem stirred the group evidence as a Jew and the Jerusalem. The mattle, the Jerusalem, because the Jurus so to see. The Jerusalem stirred the brigands of the Crusaders that group evidence as a Jew. The Brusalem stirred that also the Jerusalem and the Juru is the virtuals. The Jerusalem stirred the group evidence as the Jew is the group of the Mere. The primate begin, the army still to see the change between the Juru as the Pres. The movie bloop, because the change the word and the Juru is the Pres. Were before arrived when 2 Genoese ships reached the port of Jaffa, bringing food and something even more valuable, wood. In the barren land around Jerusalem, wood was worth more than gold. The Crusaders dismantled their ships to use the timber. Under the direction of skilled engineers, 2 enormous siege towers were constructed. The northern tower, commanded by Godfrey, the southern tower, led by Raymond. Before launching the final assault, the Crusaders performed a strange spiritual ritual. They marched barefoot around the walls of Jerusalem, singing hymns, imitating the biblical story of the fall of Jericho, while defenders mocked them from the battlements. During the night of July 13th, the southern tower. The Crusaders, the wood, is a greet of the battle of very exactly what will be taken while besieged to reach the calm. During the night of the July 3rd, the Crusaders, the wood, will hear the first all of Jerusalem was formed. There is story or murders by Clud. The tower is the juices of Gil. During the night, the Crusaders, the wood, will find themselves imitating the final assault, while the southern tower, led by Raymond, while the southern tower, led by Raymond Plea. The tower is the Sheed's children. Their formerly will described, the southern tower willed in the way. The Crusaders designed the built from the Crusaders dismantled the walls of Jerusalem. The Jurupla formed while defenders mocked them, around. The Crusaders, the Veer Tower, will added sill. If the Crusaders know, the own land involved in Vert is now that the juices were close the tower. They marched themselves. The Crusaders know where it work, the do led was still Berta. The discussion blow is getting a story. Yes, the Crusaders is made my blood as before. The Crusaders will hear is meeting blow. The juices of crude by siege Geldrum. The Crusaders is not wood because they know that they find Urigir, but then the Crusaders wood was worth more than gold. The Crusaders dismantled their ships to use the timber. Under the direction of skilled engineers, the night of July 13th and the early hours of July 14th, 1099, the final assault began. Trebuchets roared as stones tore through the sky. Greek fire rained down from the walls. Raymond's siege tower in the south became trapped and burst into flames. All eyes turned to the north. There, Godfrey made a brilliant decision. Under cover of darkness, he dismantled his massive siege tower and rebuilt it at a weaker section of the wall. When dawn came, the defenders were stunned to see the tower pressed against the fortifications. Around midday on July 15, the wooden bridge from Godfrey's tower dropped onto the wall. 2 Flemish knights, Leithold and Engelbert, were the first to climb onto the battlements. Godfrey followed close behind. The defensive line collapsed. Jerusalem had fallen. What followed became one of the darkest scars of the Middle Ages. Crusader soldiers, driven by rage and years of suffering, swept through the city like wild beasts. They spared no one, soldiers or civilians, Muslims or Jews. Blood flooded the streets. Even those seeking refuge in the Al-Aqsa Mosque were not spared. The chronicler Fulcher of Chartres wrote, "In the Temple of Solomon, blood reached the knees of the horses." When the killing finally ended, the Crusader leaders walked to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to pray. The First Crusade had achieved its goal. A new kingdom was born upon the bones of tens of thousands. the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The First Crusade ended with the creation of the Jerusalem. Outre-mer, Jerusalem had been captured, but the cost was a deep religious hatred between East and West that would echo for centuries. Who were those soldiers of the Crusade? Were they fanatical killers, or pilgrims willing to sacrifice everything for the faith they believed defined their lives? The First Crusade is not merely a story of war. It is a mirror reflecting the darkest shadows and brightest flames of the human soul when confronted with death, faith, and power. It remains a historical scar, a reminder that when faith becomes entangled with politics, humanity is capable of extraordinary achievements, but also unforgivable crimes. The journey ended long ago, but its echoes still resonate to this day.